Проводится уже третий раз и организуется лабораторией поведенческой нейродинамики Петербургского университета. И в этот раз, как вы знаете, у нас помимо традиционного формата мероприятий научных, у нас в программу входят 3 открытые лекции для широкой публики. И мне выпала честь сегодня представить первого лектора, знаменитого профессора Айрин Пепперберг из Гарвардского университета. На самом деле, конечно, Айрин Пепперберг – это одно из тех имен науки, которое в представлении совсем не нуждается. И мы все знаем, что в любой области знания есть много ученых, которые долго, кропотливо работают, годами, десятилетиями, и все равно их результаты достаточно скромные. А есть другие, которым посчастливливается сделать какое-то открытие и более значительный внести вклад в свою область. И есть единицы, которые переворачивают все и становятся такими революционерами по своей воле или по воле случая. И вот после их работ их наука никогда не бывает прежней. И вот Айрин как раз одна из них. И я бы здесь хотела вспомнить цитату другой знаменитой ученой дамы Риты Levi-Montalcini, которая получила Нобелевскую премию по медицине, по физиологии, которая говорила, что я не верю, что вообще какая-то наука была бы возможна без интуиции. И вот когда Айрин Пепперберг заканчивала сначала MIT, потом Гарвард, получила степень по теоретической химии, у нее не было никакой подготовки ни в области когнитивных наук, ни в области наук о поведении животных. Но у нее как раз было огромное количество очень мощной интуиции и веры в себя, и смелости полностью поменять сферу своих исследований и заняться той темой, которая на тот момент считалась полностью белым пятном. И даже ученые считали, что этим вообще невозможно заниматься. Это были коммуникативные способности птиц. И вот прошло 40 лет исследований непрерывных, и благодаря им мы теперь знаем, что эти коммуникативные способности очень мощные, что серые попугаи обладают понятийным мышлением и могут, в принципе, использовать довольно обширный словарь для спонтанной коммуникации с человеком. И испытуемый и очень близкий друг Айрин, серый знаменитый попугай Алекс, он, наверное, самый знаменитый, самый известный, самый любимый испытуемый среди психолингвистов и среди когнитивных ученых и много кого еще. И вот сегодня профессор Пепперберг нам расскажет про свои последние эксперименты, в которых проверяются способности серых попугаев к мысленному повторению символических знаков. И я прошу ее приветствовать. Давайте еще раз похлопаем. И я сейчас коротко повторю то, что я сказала по-английски, но последний важный комментарий. Айрин просит, когда будете фотографировать презентацию, слайды, пожалуйста, не используйте вспышку, это довольно затрудняет лекцию. Пожалуйста, эту просьбу надо учесть. And I'm shifting to English now. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the first event, to the opening of the 3rd International Neurobiology of Speech and Language Conference, which is organized by the Laboratory of Behavioral Neurodynamics of St. Petersburg University. This is already the 3rd event, and as you know, this year, apart from the more traditional formats, we also have 3 open lectures for both scientific community and general audience, and I'm thrilled to introduce the first lecturer, famous Professor Airin Pepperberg from Harvard University. And she is one of those names in science who doesn't need to be introduced at all, because as we all know, in any area of knowledge, there are many researchers who keep working for decades, and still their scientific results are more or less modest. There are others who are lucky to make some real discoveries and contribute more significantly to the area. And there are still few of them who are revolutionaries, who make some big things in science, and after them, this area of knowledge is never the same. And Airin Pepperberg is definitely one of them. And now I would like to quote one of the very impressive things from another famous lady in science, Rita Levi-Montalcini, who was awarded with a Nobel Prize for medicine, who used to say that I would not believe there would be any science at all without intuition. And coming back to Airin's work, when she graduated first from MIT and then from Harvard with a degree in theoretical chemistry, She had no background in communicative abilities of animals, in animal behavior, in cognitive science, but what she did have was her very powerful intuition and her trust in herself and great courage to shift her research to a completely different area that back then still considered a blank spot. Even scientists didn't believe that was possible to study at all. And she started studying communicative abilities of birds. And now, after almost 40 years of research, we know from the experiments that these amazing creatures, these birds, these gray parrots, they can develop things that for many years have been considered uniquely human things, like conceptual thinking and building up a very solid vocabulary for spontaneous communication with humans. And now, today, our honor is to host Ayrin here at St. Petersburg University, and she will tell us about her recent studies that are dedicated to mental abilities of gray parrots, such as mental symbolic rehearsal, that are equal to 8-year-old children. So again, welcome Ayrin Pepperberg, and please do not take pictures with flash. I'm passing the microphone to Professor Pepperberg. Enjoy.
First, want to say thank you so much for the honor of being here and for the honor of being the first speaker this time. This is really quite exciting. So let me start. And I think they're going to change the microphone for a second. I'm a little shorter. Okay, is that good now? All right. So my first slide is just the usual thank you slide. And seriously, after 40 years, I cannot list all the people who have helped me in this work. All right, so let me start by a little bit of history. In 1983, Premack wrote a paper arguing that non-humans that understood and could use symbolic representation could solve complex tasks at levels beyond those of subjects lacking such abilities. And this was extremely controversial at the time. Other researchers also around that time were arguing that speech is special, okay, and that animals that didn't have speech obviously could not do any kind of complex communicative tasks. Now, many disagree, but vocal learning does seem to be somewhat important in the evolution of language. And interestingly, only a few non-humans engage in vocal learning, and the most common species that do are the songbirds and the parrots. So if we look at the primate lineage, for example, we see that we start with animals, like the small monkeys. They have referential alarm calls, but the calls themselves are not learned. They learn how to use them. The calls are innately specified, and then the animals learn how to use them. We have, of course, on the other side, humans that have great complex communication skills, and somewhere in the middle we have the so-called missing link, where the suggestion is that there's some kind of vocalizations, grunts, and sounds that are connected to actions and that establish some kind of a communicative system, but we don't know anything about it. What we do know is that there were changes in the brain. I think I should have asked how this worked. Well, all right, you can just see it, and let's see if the will work. Okay. Anyway, you can see that there are changes in the brain from the monkey systems to the human system that have allowed the development of our complex communicative system called language. So what about other lineages? And what about other vocal learners and possible links between symbolic communication and cognition? And that particular area, what Premack started, is what I'm fascinated by these days. If you look at the birds, Jarvis, in a seminal paper in around 2005, argues that some common ancestor to what's called the language strip in humans, a song strip in songbirds, and a vocalization strip in parrots. And he argues about this because each pathway seems to involve 7 structures, and these structures are not connected in exactly the same ways. they function in very similar ways in allowing these animals to do complex communicative skills. So again, if you sort of want to look at a lineage tree, you kind of start with the dinosaurs, and then you have like chickens, where they're, again, like the apes, there are referential calls for predators. The calls themselves are not learned, but their functional use of them is learned. You then have what are called the sub-oscines, the birds that do not learn their songs, although they do sing. And what they do is combine these very simple songs, things like Phoebe-o, with actions to establish very complex communication skills. So if you understand what you're watching when you see these birds, they will make certain sounds and certain actions, and you know they're going to attack another bird. Or they'll do certain other things, and you know they're just going to sit quietly on the perch. You then go to the songbirds, where there are complex, learned, multiple songs. Various different songs are used in different contexts for mate attraction versus territorial defense. And the parrots, which also have very complex communication skills. We spent weeks and weeks on several field seasons trying to understand them. All that we could find out was that there are certain vocalizations that are aggressive, certain are affiliative, and many, many different vocalizations within all those different categories. We also propose that there's some kind of missing link also in the avian system. So essentially, you can draw parallels between the monkey system and that of, say, the chickens, between the apes and the sub-oscine songbirds, between the missing link in humans and what's purportedly a possible missing link in the songbird system. There's a bird called the bellbird, which is ostensibly a sub-oscine, but it has vocal dialects, and you only see dialects in birds that learn their song. So this is an aspect of the birdsong literature that people are still very interested in and trying to explore as to whether this bird could be a potential missing link. And then, of course, you've got, on the other end, I'm not going to try to say that our parrots are like adult humans, but they are very much like young children in that they have a certain amount of speech, they use it referentially, they use it meaningfully, they communicate extensively with those vocalizations. So again, you might argue that many species begin with a truly basic learning and imitation center that's responsible. It's responsible for things like neonate imitation. It's not under any conscious control, and that it develops eventually, both when you look at over evolutionary time and within humans, for example, and within some of these birds, or developmentally over age, into the system that is responsible for referential communication, if not full language. This system can encode the relationship between another agent's action, the context of the action, and the ability to replicate the action. In humans, this eventually develops into the full-blown language-related brain, and for which some bird brains demonstrate striking parallels. Now, today, I'm not going to talk too much about those parallels, but I want to focus on how vocal learning enables symbolic representation and thereby enables additional cognitive advances. I want to examine briefly why parrots can use symbolic representation and learn advanced cognitive concepts. And the majority of my talk will be discussing two experiments for which we believe symbolic representation was critical for their success. So again, a little bit of history. When I began this work in the 1970s, basically the term avian cognition was an oxymoron. People felt that birds were, totally incapable of any kind of complex cognitive processing, incapable of anything but the most simplest of noise sounds. Any research that was being done on these topics were being done with the great apes that had a close phylogenetic relationship to humans, or dolphins that had a large brain. And so when I proposed in my very first grant proposal to study communicative and cognitive abilities of African gray parrots, the reviewers very literally asked me what I was smoking. And of course, this was the 70s. And again, they had good reason to say these kinds of things. Birds, parrots were known as simple mimetic birds. They could just pollywog a cracker. There was no understanding that these vocalizations could have any meaning, and very little was known about avian brains, okay? Over the last 2 decades, however, there's an amazing amount of data from avian neurobiologists that have provided the rationale for the data that I will be presenting. But when I gave my first talks, people literally got up and said, well, this can't be true. There's no cortex. And I would say, well, these are my data. Go find it. And eventually they did. So the issue is that you've got this small blob of protoplasm, okay, and you look at the relative size between the avian brain and the human brain. There are no sulci, there are no gyri, okay? It's just a small, tiny little blob. And yet it does the kinds of things that our brain does. And how does that happen? Well, it turns out that not only do they have areas functionally equivalent to the primate neocortex, but these cortices are larger than or comparable to primates of the same body mass size, and they have an average twice as many neurons as primates of comparable size. So these brains are densely packed, all right? And there's all these references. If you want them, you can email me later or talk to me later about them. These brains also have a unique shell, and particularly in parrots, that are likely responsible for the ability to reproduce heterospecific vocalizations, and tentatively, it's proposed that these are responsible for the cognitive capacities of these birds. And like mammals, their brainstem nuclei connecting telencephalon and cerebellum also purportedly associated with the evolution of complex cognitive abilities. So whatever that little blob of protoplasm is doing, it's doing what our brain is doing. And over the course of the 40 years plus that I've been working with these birds, okay, Alex, my most famous subject, he learned labels for about 150 different objects, colors, shapes. He learned 7 colors, 5 shapes, labels for categories. So he not only knew the labels, rose, green, blue, purple, whatever, but he understood that they were subsumed under a category called color. And the same is true for shape. He understood 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cornered went under shape. He understood that paper and cork and wood and wool went under the category of matter, okay? So he had concepts of categories. You could show him any 2 objects and ask him what was same or what was different, and he would tell you the label of the category, okay? If there was nothing same or everything was same, he would say, and you ask him these questions, he said none. So he had a concept of absence. He understood relative size, so you could show him any 2 objects and say what color bigger, what color smaller, what matter bigger, what matter smaller. When we showed him for the first time 2 objects of the same size and asked him what color bigger, he transferred his understanding of same and different, of none from same and different, to none for the category of size, and he told us that they were none bigger or none smaller. He understood number concepts. I could give an hour-long lecture on number concepts. Basically, he understands number concepts at the level of about 4 or 5-year-old children and at levels that have not yet been shown in the great apes. He learned most of his abilities through a modeling technique that was developed by Dietmar Todt and heavily depended on joint attention. So just like young children, when we're working with the bird, we jointly attend with the bird on a particular object, and we talk about the colors and the shapes and the other qualities about it. If we had our back to the bird, we're talking like this, just like you couldn't hear me, they wouldn't understand that what I was talking about was related to what they were playing with. So we have to jointly attend to these things, just like young children. Alex understood recursion, not at the level of humans, where we talk about, this is the cat that bit the rat that ate the cheese, and they all lived in the house that Jack built, so everything recursively responds to Jack, that house. But that, along with conjunction, in terms of you could give him a big tray of different objects and say, what object is green and 3 corners? Or what color is 3 corners and wood? So we'd have to recursively go back to the original attribute. He could transfer, as I mentioned, he transferred concept of absence to different types of subjects. His vocalizations were intentional. He had phrases like, I want X and want to go Y, where X and Y were appropriate object or location labels. If he asked for a banana and you gave him a grape, he would literally take the grape and throw it at you and go, want banana, and make it very clear as to what he wanted. He had fast mapping of a sort in that he would make up vocalizations, and then if we could map something onto them, they would become embedded in his repertoire. So he learned the color gray by seeing himself in a mirror and asking what color. We told him it was gray, and he started to use it appropriately. He then played around with it and came up with grape, grain, chain, cane, things like that, so that we could give him the objects and they became completely embedded in his repertoire. He made up a couple of labels, so he came up with banary, combining banana cherry for an apple, on the assumption that it was, tasted a little bit like a banana and looked like a big cherry. He came up with banacker, but he didn't like the dried banana chips that we gave him, so he didn't keep saying banacker. So he had to like what it was that we gave him. But this was a way of increasing his repertoire. And here's a little bit of vocalization so you can hear him. What corn? What wheat? Want wheat, little bits of cereal. Okay, so you get a feeling for his vocalizations. Okay, so recently we've been focusing on perception and cognition using symbolic representation. Work on number concepts, optical illusions, which he sees as we do, visual memory, liquid conservation, Piagetian studies on liquid conservation, and probabilistic reasoning. And I'm going to spend today talking about the visual memory and the probabilistic reasoning, because I think those are the most fun topics that we've been working on recently. So visual search, this was done with the assistance of a postdoc in the Vision Lab, Hreg Palian. And this is an interesting topic because for humans, visual working memory allows us to build mental models of the world and simulate alternative realities, providing a mean for flexible adaptive behaviors. I mean, basically, we can stand at a crossroads and think about different possible ways that we could choose to do things and the effects that would have on our lives. Okay, and visual working memory has been extensively studied both in human and non-human objects. There's nothing special about that. However, there's something called visual working memory manipulation, and that is not at all well understood. And that involves basically thinking about where things are and then remembering where they are after we've manipulated them. So what are the limits on how we can operate on that stored information that we have to solve a lot of different problems in our world? What are the evolutionary bases for that behavior? And is it, a signature of human cognition, or is it widespread among non-humans? Now, keeping track of things in the world is crucial for survival. Predators and prey both must know where they are, and this changes at a moment's notice. So that lion pack is really, checking out where those wildebeests are, and everything, if you've ever been watching that in Africa, it's lightning, how things change at a moment's notice. And the animals that you thought were going to survive don't, and the ones that you thought were not going to make it somehow do. Think of birds eating their fledglings, okay? They've got a bunch of fledglings, they're literally bouncing around on the perches, they're moving around. Mom and dad have to remember who got fed and who didn't get fed. And this is critical for survival. Okay, so this behavior is not the same as the classic shell game. So the classic shell game, you have the little red block, you cover it, and then you do some movements, and then I ask you to find the red block, and it's not easy, but many of you can find it. Okay, now imagine tracking many things simultaneously. All right, so we've covered 3 different things. And now I'm moving all these things around. Now, where's the yellow block? That's a lot harder. All right? So we gave variations of this task to adults, to children, and to the gray parrot griffin. And there were several stages. So we started with 2 cups with no swaps, then with 1, 2, 3, and 4 swaps. Then we went to 3 cups with all those swaps, then to 4 cups with all those swaps. Okay? And the point about this work is that Griffin had no special training. We had him watch us do 3 of these trials so he would understand the basis for the behavior. He already understood match to sample. That sort of came out with all the labeling work. He had the exact same number of trials as did the humans and the children, and in the same order. And he got a cashew as a reward. Children got little stickers. So I'm going to show you, this is from the front, and this is from an aerial view. And I'm going to show you all these different permutations. Now watch what's going on here. I'm covering them. Okay, and what's the one he taps is what's correct. So he can look around, but it's the one he taps. And he got it right. I don't know if any of you could have done that. I certainly couldn't. So for set size 2, here's his data compared to adults and to children. He's really, really good. For set size 3, he had one little blip there. I think he was not paying attention on one of the trials, but essentially he is so much better, even up to 4 switches, than the adults and the children. For set size 4, he starts out much, much better. Then he sort of loses it a little bit. But he's still basically at the level of the children. And we couldn't do set size 4 and 4 swaps with the children. They just would not sit still literally sit still for this. So we don't know what their data would have been. So for 0, 1, 2 swaps, he's equal to or outperforms the children and the adults for all set sizes. For 3 and 4 swaps, he outperforms human and children for all sizes except 4, where his data suggests he's initially better than adults, but for 3 and 4 swaps, he's at least as good as 8-year-old children. For set size 5, he's at 100%, and adults, humans, cannot do 100% for set size 5. So statistical analyses show that this ability increases across lifespan in humans, and Griffin was 23 when we were doing this, so he had a bit of an advantage over the children in some respect, but still, he's still a parrot. And we don't know if this depends on a shared resource, such that the storage ability must reach its full level before manipulation ability can proceed further. We think that is the case. Children are quite good at the storage at the young ages. It's that manipulation that starts. Their manipulation is just basically moved down along with their storage. So if their storage goes down a little bit, the manipulation goes down and the curves match. In any case, he's really, really good at this, much better than children by a huge margin at small sets, and fails to match adult humans on only at the most difficult tasks. It might have to be with the stability of his representations and some kind of interference, possibly an important difference with adult humans. But what was really, really interesting was respect to the most difficult transitions, okay? My Harvard students who were videotaping also failed on a lot of these tasks, all right? And the students who did succeed, and this is the critical point for the talk, the students who did succeed say they used color labels and mentally rehearsed positions in an N-1 strategy. So for the 4 swaps and the 4 objects, they would think red, green, blue, yellow, red, yellow, green, blue. And they would rehearse that. And the idea is that you have to have vocal labels to do that. Well, Griffin knows his vocal labels. Maybe that's what he was doing. And maybe that's how he could do this task. And so we're planning to test this in Tenerife now with non-labeling grays. We have access to 12 gray parrots and in the Loro Park. And I've also convinced my friends at Vienna, University of Vienna, to look at this with caching corvids, because one of our thoughts is that the caching corvids would be really, really good at this, even better than the parrots, because they have to remember where their caches are, and they also move their caches from time to time and have to re-update this ability. So we will see, to be continued. We've also done another set of experiments with Griffin to figure out what is going on those 4 swaps, and we're crunching the data as I speak. But again, the take-home message to this, is that his abilities are far beyond what we would have expected. So the second study is on probability, and this was done with my students. Catherine Clements proposed this project as it was a paper in my class that she did. The final in my classes are always design an experiment. And she designed this experiment. It was so good that I asked her to work in the lab and do it with us. And so that's where this came from. So this is probability. It's basic Piagetian probabilistic studies. And it involves the ability to make generalizations about a sample based on information about a population. Okay, that's a scientific gobbledygook in regular English. So I give you 3 red beads and 1 blue bead. That's the population. What is the likelihood, if I throw them in a box and mix it up and pull one out, that you'll have a blue bead in the mix? All right, that's the classic Piagetian task. However, people have looked at variations on this task, and they claim that children as young as 7 months old can do this. Piaget found that his children could not do this until they were about 7 years old. So the issue is, what is going on here? And my argument is that the different tasks test different types of abilities. So the task given to the human infants may have more to do with habituation than with inductive understanding, and I'll give you a few examples. So in one task, the experimenter has a big box, you can see it on the top there, and they slowly remove 1 ball at a time from each box and put it in a little box. And they fill up the little box. And then they open the big box, and some of them, have a mixture that doesn't match the mixture in the small box. And the children look more when there's a mismatch. So it would seem that the infants are tracking probability, but maybe not. Sometimes just they look longer because there's a perceptual mismatch. It's just more interesting. It doesn't require them to understand anything about the ratio or the relationship between the sample and the population. So other researchers did another study where they show a kind of this little balloon thing with objects bouncing around over time, and then a curtain falls down, and then one of 2 objects falls out, either the blue thing or the red thing, and the children look longer when it was a minority item. And people claimed, aha, again, probability. But it could just be novelty. I mean, there are fewer red things, and so it's just more exciting when the red thing falls out. It's not that they understand it, they're just responding to something that could be more of interest. Again, the older children see the classic probability. 3 things of one type are put in the box, 1 of another. The can is then shaken. 1 block is removed while hidden in the hand. Whoops, sorry. Okay. That really flapped up. Okay. And then the child is asked to label the color of the hidden block. Before age 6, 6-year-old children, you get answers sketchy, like red because it's my favorite color. Or, well, you put 1 red one in and you took 1 thing out, so it has to be red. There's logic there, but it's not exactly the right logic. You can see the brains, they're trying to come up with something, but they don't quite get it. Only later, and this is, we're talking about children between 6 to 7 years old, well, they'll come up with something and say, well, blue because it's the mostest. But it takes a long time. Now, many of these studies used additional controls to ensure that the alternative explanations that I've given were ruled out, but it's still kind of weird that the young children seem to succeed while the older children fail. And what I'm arguing is that the task-given infants rely on post hoc observations. Something is weird. They don't necessarily know what, they just know something is weird. The older children, or we call them pre-hoc, it's expectancies, it's reasoning. They have to encode their responses vocally and understand that although proportions control this likelihood, it doesn't guarantee a particular result. I mean, sometimes when I put my hand in that bucket, I really am going to bring up the red ball. It does happen. Okay, not very often, but it can happen. So prior to our study, the only non-humans that had been tested in this have been the great apes and capuchin monkeys. And they were given very simple types of tasks, similar to given young children, very young children, in what they call a crawling to a preferred set procedure. All right, so what you do is you take two buckets and you have them filled with, either more pink candies or more black candies, and you figure out beforehand whether the children like the pink or the black more, and you work on that basis, and basically you let them crawl to the bucket that they want you to take a candy out of and give it to them, all right? For the apes, they gave them buckets of bananas and carrots, and they very much prefer the banana pieces. So you can see all those different ratios that the apes were given. But unlike the children and eventually our bird, the buckets were always in view. So the apes didn't have to remember something about the representations. So it was much easier. And each set of trials for the apes had a different type of control. So they may have responded with the different types of strategies. So if you look at all those buckets, you can see you can simply avoid a bucket with a few favorite candies or bananas. You could avoid a bucket that's tainted with disfavored issues. And this goes back to something called suboptimal choice, which is really quite odd, but it has to do with the fact that if I give you a choice between, say, one piece of cheese and a piece of cheese plus a carrot, you might just choose the cheese by itself if you really hate carrots, because somehow the carrot makes the cheese less good. And there are actual studies on this with humans. And none of the trials for the apes had all of the controls in place. So again, to try to explain this in terms of real-life situations, okay, the difference between these early and later childhood tasks can be, I can give you an example. Imagine a sparrow with two songs. Its favorite song, which it sings a majority of time, and a less favorite one that it sings only once in a while. Maybe it's harder to produce, we don't know. But we know if we tape this bird, we'll hear it sing the songs in a different proportion. So the early childhood choice is like having him choose between two patches and deciding based on the variance of the patch, and which one would it be easier for him to defend his territory? Well, obviously the one that has his majority song, because he can do much better at it, all right? The task giving the older children compares to his being in a patch with three singers of his majority and one of his minority, and testing how many times he chooses to sing each song to best defend his space. So he has to make choices based on what he knows is going on in the system. So given all these differences and all the different results and all these problems, we decided to use a standard Piagetian task because we had a gray parrot who could talk, could actually tell us, what was in our hand when we pulled it out of the bucket. And we decided to use one of the more difficult proportions for the children, that 1-to-3 proportion. Now, the other difference that, becomes problematic for us was that when people do the childhood studies, they have 100 children and you give each child 1 to 2 trials, and that's fine, and they're happy. We had one parrot. We had to give him 96 trials for statistical significance. We had to give him only 1 or 2 trials per day. We had to separate the trials by days because he'd see the bucket and he'd look at us and go, want to go back because he could never be 100% correct. He could only guess, and Griffin hates guessing. So it took us a very long time to get these 96 trials. All right, and to keep him interested in the task and to avoid having him use answers based on mass or contour, we used lots of different sets of items. So we couldn't just say, oh, it's always going to be, there's going to be 3 corks and 1 key, and it's always going to be cork. We used mixtures of wood and wool and paper and keys and cork, and we switched minority-majority reversals. So on some trials there could be more corks than keys, and on some more keys than corks. And we lined the box so he couldn't hear the clunk of anything going in. And we timed our removals so that we pulled out the majority and minority after the same number of seconds, so he couldn't think, oh, she's searching around for the minority and that must be it. And basically, he couldn't know what we removed, okay? He had to guess. So for us, the question was, would he just guess randomly, thinking this is crazy, I'm just going to be totally random? Would he guess just more is more likely and always go to 100% majority? Or would he choose based on the ratio of what he saw put in, 75-25? And we did indeed pull the minority object 25% of the time using random.org to make sure that it was totally random. And he tracked the probability exactly. And I had the students recalculate because this is too good. It was exactly 73-23. And the type of object didn't matter. He monitored the proportions over time, whatever we were doing. And importantly, what the critical issue here is not how many times he is correct, because he can't be correct. He can't know what's there, okay? He was only correct about 60% of the time. What's critical is that how he was dealing with this uncertainty. All right, what was he doing when given this uncertainty? We had to test for primacy versus recency effects. So the idea was if he saw us put in, one thing first, did he focus on that and just keep talking about that? Or did he focus on the most recent thing we dumped in and focus on that? And he didn't. He showed a very slight recency effect, but it wasn't statistically significant. We also had to test if he had the gambler's facility and basing the result on the prior trial. Now, granted, the prior trial meant like 1 trial per day more, sometimes it was the first or the second trial, but still, was that important? And the answer was no, okay? Because we could do it based on first versus second trials, and it didn't matter what the prior trial was. We did pull out the minority 25% of the time. Did we cue him in any which way? And no, it didn't matter, all right? So he was tracking the probability of the set. Now, in reality, okay, that is not optimal. If you really understand probability, what you should do is always guess the majority item, okay, because that is really the thing most likely to come out. But that's how Vegas and other gambling roulette places do so well, because people don't do that. They track the probability. They know that it can't always be the majority, so they try to guess when the minority is going to come up. You can't. It's random. But if you look at people at various gambling type situations, that's exactly what humans do. And that's exactly what Griffin was doing. Okay? So we can't state that he understood probability at the level of you and me. He did succeed at the level of these 7-year-old children. And, of course, his use of referential labeling was crucial for testing. He could not have done this if he couldn't label the objects. So, again, I believe that there is something that really makes him special, and we have several other different types of topics where it really seems that his ability to label and Alex's ability to label gives them an edge. In terms of number concepts, Alex's ability to label exact sets allowed him to do number concepts at levels that you couldn't only see in the few apes that also had symbolic representation. Now, the interesting thing, Parrots and primates, you know, it's 300 million years since the evolutionary split. So we've got this convergent evolution, and it's quite likely that these concepts are quite, you know, widespread across species. If you look at the way parrots are in the wild, and this is a picture of gray parrots in Cameroon in 1997, and I have to say that because if you went back to our study site now, you might see 3 parrots. They have hit CITES 1 endangered species. And I've talked to people who've been looking at elephants in our study sites, and they're so excited because they saw 5 parrots. And this is what we saw in 1997. But the point of this slide is not to yell at you about conservation. It's to say that these parrots live in the same environment as the great apes. We suggest that the same evolutionary pressures that were exerted to get the intelligence of the great apes were exerted on the parrot precursors as well. They are what are known in the ecological literature as K-selected, meaning they're long-lived, they have very few offspring at a time, they invest heavily in those offspring, okay? They basically have a complex ecological system. They, like the primates, they forage 60 kilometers a day, so that they have to keep a memory of this huge area, where there are the trees that are fruiting, which tree did they eat all the ripe fruit from today so that they shouldn't go back for another week or so, which tree over their long lifetime has died, where are there new trees coming up in those areas, all right? In terms of the social system, they're in a fission-fusion collection. They go off in small groups of about 5 or 6 birds to forage at a time. We don't know if they're family groups. And then they collect the savanna in groups of about 100 or so. They'll then break off again, and at night they used to be groups of like 700 birds at a time. So they're constantly learning about different relationships, and to be able to survive in this situation, given that there are dominance hierarchies, they have to understand things like transitive inference. If Sam beat up on Joe and Joe beat up on me, I don't go near Sam. Okay? I infer that Sam is a much stronger bird just from my interactions with Joe and knowing Joe's interactions with Sam. And you multiply this over the course of the flock. So they have all this incredible complex information that they have to deal with on a daily basis to survive. And we think that's why when we take them into the laboratory and we test them, they do so very well. So again, I'm sort of summarizing that there's this advanced avian cognition. They've got the cognitive abilities of about a 7-year-old, maybe 8, sometimes 6, depending on the task. Their communicative abilities are much more like about a 1.5 or 2-year-old, but they use a symbolic representation and they encode their responses vocally. And they can't have a communication the way you and I do at that level, but they communicate with us about the situations in which we are testing them. And they're doing it at that level, they're doing it at very advanced abilities. So we continue to work on a number of different cognitive tasks to determine the limits of their abilities. And again, the take-home messages, they have this use of symbolic representation, a possible language precursor. And I really do think that allows them to work with us at these levels that you would not see with animals that didn't have these abilities. So I want to thank you very much for listening. And I think we can do some questions. Yes, people will translate for me. And again, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. And yes, we do have some time for questions. У нас есть время на некоторое количество вопросов. У нас есть 2 микрофона в конце зала. Один здесь, он будет у Айрин. Пожалуйста, можно поднимать руки, и мы будем координировать.
Okay. 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 And then they will explain.
Hello. Thank you for the very interesting lecture. I have a question. Did you have the experience with your bird, Griffin? Did he actually try to understand, is this a human talking to him or maybe a computer program? So did bird has these abilities to understand which person is talking to him, or these actually commands are from fake publisher or something? So did he actually interact with people, or maybe a computer?
No, he interacts with people. He starts conversations, but Alex more so than Griffin. But he will ask you, for Alex in particular, if you brought in something new, he'd ask you the color, he'd ask you the shape, he'd say, "What's that?" Griffin, not so much, but Alex definitely. So they would initiate communication. And if he wanted to learn the label, he would keep asking so he could hear you say it. So we'd get into this thing, "What color?" And I'd say, "Brown." He'd say, "What color?" "Brown." And then he would start trying to say it.
How this actually, these process are initialized? So this label process, because I don't think it's just from he's born, when he's born. So you need to actually to teach him how to label things.
Yeah. Oh, how did we teach?
Yeah.
We mostly used a modeling system. I didn't have time to go into it, but I'm happy you asked. So we would have the parrot on a perch. We had an object that it really wanted. This is how we started. And I had a student sitting next to me. So this is make-believe. This is the bird. There's a student and me, and I have the object. And I show it to the student. I say, "What's this?" And if she answers correctly, she gets the object, and she gets to play with it. And he's looking very excited because he wants the object. Then we exchange the roles. So she's the model for his behavior and his rival for my attention, because we're not looking at him, we're just working. Then she asks me, and the first time I'll answer correctly and I'll play with it, but every once in a while we'll make a mistake. So he sees that not every weird sound, the same will cause this transfer. So for example, she says it to me, I go, "Key," and I get it, and I play with it. The next time I go, "Rrr," and she goes, "No, you're wrong." So it's not, "Rrr" isn't going to work, but "key" works. They can't produce the sound immediately. They have to learn how to control the muscles in their syrinx, in the trachea somewhat, the larynx, the glottis, just like you and me, the tongue going in and back and up and down, opening and closing the beak. But they will come out initially with something like "ee," okay, for the key, and then over time we will shape it by saying things like, "That's close, say better." And we'll model "e" and then "key," and that's how they learn it. And after a while, it turns out that they sometimes we want them to learn labels for things that they don't particularly are interested in. So we taught them to request. That's when the "what" came in. So they can say, so if you tell me the color of this thing, you can ask for something else you want. And they learn that interaction.
So that's actually the tough process, because that's why you actually try to taught him this kind of middle labels from the banana, and you tell about the apple, the cherry, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And how much does it take to actually learn a new label? Because it looks like maybe a month of intense work.
It depends on the label. So some sounds like "p" for paper with no lips, very long time. Like "key," it's quick because the "k" sound is in here, and it's easy. "V," also the no lips, very hard. So some things are easy, some things are hard. If he already has the sound, so once he learned the "p" in paper, okay, he could go to parrot and learn the word parrot, things like that. Or he learned carrot overnight because he had the "k" from key and the rest of the sound from parrot.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. First of all, what is the average amount of words that gray parrot is capable of learning?
I'm sorry, what's the
average amount
number?
of words, yes, that gray parrot is capable of learning?
Okay, it depends on what you mean by learning. So my birds learn about 150 words. If they are just producing the sounds, there are records of 600 or 700.
No, I meant...
But we work, and I also have to say that there's the limit because I am less interested in increasing the vocabulary than in the concepts. So we only train labels for what we need for our research, and sometimes they'll pick up labels like for food on their own, but we don't just train labels for the sake of labels. So they may be able to learn more. Our birds just seem to be limited to about that because that's what we're interested in.
Okay, and the second question, you said that you're going to try the same experiments with other parrots. And what are the other species of parrots that are potentially capable of doing the same?
Okay. Well, we have access, in terms of the cognitive abilities, we have access to a macaw and 2 species of Amazons, as well as the greys in Tenerife. So we could look at those in terms of the cognitive abilities. In terms of vocal learning, I think we would have to adapt our training techniques a little bit to the other birds because they're in terms of attention spans and things like that. So that's a separate topic, and we haven't yet tried that. And that's something it's really limited in our access to these birds and the amount of time we would have to do. It's also important, we've learned, that the birds need to be kept separate from one another when they're first learning their labels. Because if they're together with one another, our youngest bird, Athena, she's always with Griffin, and she really thinks that she just needs to talk parrot, because they spend a lot of time whistling and chatting with one another in parrot. Alex was an only bird for 15 years. So he learned that if he wanted to communicate with any other creature, it had to be in English. And this turns out to be very important because people have tried to replicate our work. Having birds in an aviary, it doesn't work. The birds have to really be separated out so that they're forced to learn to communicate with us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention. Would you kindly, if you don't mind, how many birds do you have in the last experiment? Was it just Griffin or was it...
Yes, it was just Griffin, because at that point, Alex had passed away many years ago. Athena has only learned a few labels at this stage, so we couldn't use her.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Скажите, пожалуйста, вот вы сказали, что один попугай смышленнее другого, ну, в переводе так было. А зависит ли эта смышленность и вообще способности от возраста попугая? И с какого возраста вот попугаи могут демонстрировать осваивать такие способности и демонстрировать? Спасибо.
No translation yet.
А вот так он заработал.
Техническая пауза, извините. Попробуйте, пожалуйста, еще раз.
Да. Спасибо. Вы сказали, что один попугай смышленнее другого. У меня вопрос. Вот этот смышленый...
Одну минутку.
Да может вы так и переведете.
Попробуйте, пожалуйста, извините, еще раз.
Еще раз, да?
По-русски мы попробуем перевести.
Да, спасибо большое. Вы сказали, что один попугай смышленнее другого, и вопрос, вот, собственно, это смышленность и сами способности осваивать, воспроизводить эти действия, зависит от возраста. Из какого возраста попугаи могут это делать? Спасибо.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned in your talk that one of the parrots was sort of smarter than another one. So from what age do they start developing these cognitive abilities, and whether we can measure it?
Okay, so they start learning to talk very, very young. Griffin started at about 13 or 14 weeks, making some sounds. Alex, I didn't get till he was a year old. And the problem with Griffin is that Alex dominated him. So that when we were trying to train Griffin, I'd say, Griffin, what color? And Alex would sit on the next cage and say, no, tell me what shape. So Griffin would look at me, look at Alex, and go. So he became the student just tell me what I have to do to get the A. He didn't want to try hard to try to solve problems. It was just tell me what to do, and I'll do it absolutely perfectly. And you can see, when we give him a task, he does it extremely well. But he doesn't like to solve the problems. So I don't think it's that he's less smart. In some ways, I think he's smarter, but he's a different type of smart. And Athena has we joke, the term is no off switch. She's quite hyperactive, and her attention span is very short compared to Alex and to Griffin. So it's hard, it's a challenge to work with her. So there are personality differences, but she's extremely smart and manipulative in getting what she wants. And there are anecdotes I could tell you that it's very clear she's extremely smart. She just doesn't want to be smart in the way that I would like her to be smart, so I could test her scientifically.
Thank you very much for this illuminating talk. Just a couple of short questions. The first one is if there is any evidence about the capability of parrots to build and use tools, as it happens with crowds, for example. And the second question is that if we imagine that a couple of these parrots learn the same set of symbolic associations, would you guess that they would use this kind of culture between them without the human beings?
Greys do not seem to use much tools. Cockatoos do. So if you're interested in tool use in parrots, look at the work by Alice Ausberg. It's beautiful work on tool use. Greys tend to not use tools very much. I'm not sure why, but they really don't. In terms of talking to one another, we do have this little bit of evidence with Alex and Griffin, where Alex would be questioning Griffin, and just before Alex died, we actually got him to work as one of the models in the system. So he would take turns with us asking me questions and asking Griffin questions. So I think down the road, that's a possibility. Okay? You know, I don't know with Athena what's happening, because she's just a little bit different. But I think they will use, they just to a small extent, they will use these vocalizations with one another. Probably not at the level, it's easier to use parrot.
Thank you for your lecture, and I would like to ask you, do you plan to learn Griffin some not material understanding material objects like color and shape, but learn to understand some abstract notions like confusing or liking something, and one day he said, "Oh, I'm confused, I don't know what's the shape or what's the color."
That's a very good question, because people are actually trying to look at that with non-vocal tasks with a lot of different subjects. And the problem is trying to figure out how to train something like that, all right, without getting particularly a bird, some of the birds to sort of just use the term when they don't want to work. So, for example, right now, when Griffin doesn't want to work, he'll say, "Want to go back," or he'll turn around and start preening, rather than using something like that. On a related, I can answer a related question, though, in terms of people ask me, why don't you give them terms for emotions? And I say that it's very hard to understand as a human what another human is experiencing in an emotion. Sometimes even it's hard for us to understand our own emotions. So that trying to figure out, well, is he confused? Is he angry? Is he tired? Or something like that is very hard to train a label in that sense. So we've avoided that just because it's so difficult in this stage.
Thank you. My question is about comparison apes and parrots. Have you ever compared them on the same task? And I heard that you compared parrots with humans and apes with humans. And have you ever had tests between parrots and apes? Thank you.
Okay, so I can't work with apes myself. So what I have to do when I'm doing things like that is rely on my colleagues who have published other papers or who are willing to work with me. So what we try to do is to go into the literature and do those kinds of comparisons. So we've just done a study on Piagetian liquid over-conservation. And it turns out, as we were going through the ape study, we found some confounds with their tasks. So we didn't want to replicate those tasks. So we did what we think are more interesting tasks. But on the tasks that we did, some of the tasks we could replicate exactly, and the parrots did at least as well on the tasks. And on one of the tasks, they did better. So I think one of the problems with the apes studies is that the apes are, they're like Athena. Their attention spans are kind of short, and getting them to really focus is hard. And I think that on some of the tasks that they could get them to, calm down and focus better, they would respond better. But they're so impulsive in some of these tasks. We did a task, it's called the ephemeral choice task. And okay, think about this. Okay, you have two plates. One is black and one is white. And each of them have a treat on them. If you choose the black plate, I will also let you eat what's off the white plate. But if you choose the white plate, you can only eat what's on the white plate. So how long does it take to learn which plate to choose? Well, it turns out that wrasse fish that actually have something like this in the wild, it takes them about 30 trials. It took our parrots less than 30 trials. Apes could not do this on over 100 trials. Capuchin monkeys were about 50 or 70 trials, somewhere in there. And it was the impulsivity of the apes. And they finally figured out a task related to this where they could separate the impulsivity, and then the apes could do it. But they couldn't do the exact task because of the impulsivity. We also did a delayed gratification study, and Griffin waited for 15 minutes for a better reward, which is quite a bit longer, again, the apes, because of this impulsivity issue.
Thank you very much. My question is somehow related to this one because I was wondering why to compare birds with humans and apes with humans. Is it possible to measure cognitive possibilities, cognitive abilities in somehow independent tool without comparative with human children's?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I have to say that it's very easy to take these tasks that were used, that have standards, that people agree test intelligence. And so it's much easier to take one of those tasks and adapt them for the birds than to try to come up with a separate task. Because then if you come up with this and the birds succeed, people could argue that it's not a well-respected task. It's not an accepted task. So, I mean, it would be fun, but I think it would be harder to get it accepted in the literature as a valid task. And people might argue that it's something just very specific to a parrot, for example, and that, another animal couldn't do it because they're not a parrot. So it's a very interesting question, and it's not a matter of laziness, but it's a matter of saying, okay, people accept this as a tool for testing intelligence, so let's just see how we can adapt this for the parrots.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I want to ask you a question from my mom. She studied students and scholarship, school children for some period of time, some of my relatives too, and they said that when you train children, they also train you. And I had a friend who were dog masters, and they said that when you train dog, the dog trains you too, and the same with the horses. So what these birds trained you, for example, your own tests on these things are better now than 20 years ago or not?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it.
When you work with somebody, when you study, for example, the children at school or a student, you not only train him, but when you study the children, for example, if I will study this girl somebody, yes, she will also train me for something, yes. And the specialists who work with dogs, they say that not only they train dogs, but the dogs train their teachers, yes, their coaches. So what these birds trained you, for example, your own personal tests are better than 20 years with ваш личный тест наперстками лучше, чем 20 лет назад?
I really apologize. I'm just not following the question. Okay, maybe you can do.
The question is.
Okay. Okay, so how do the parrots train us? Okay. This is...
Well, as far as I understand from your lecture,
right.
your own personal test must be better than 20 years ago.
It is a very interactive process. And what we've learned that there are certain types of tasks that the birds are very eager to do, and we therefore tend to focus on those types of tasks, so they sort of trained us. So for example, the Piagetian liquid conservation and over-conservation, they love drinking juice. So it's very, so they sort of trained us that we should do those types of tasks because they like to do them. And with the probability, we're trying to do the next stage in probability, a different proportion. And every time Griffin sees that bucket come out, we've even changed the color of the bucket, but he sees that bucket and he goes, want to go back. And he just doesn't want to work because it's such a frustrating task. So in a lot of ways, they've trained us on the types of tasks that they want to do versus, anything else. It's subtle, but it's there, yes.
Thank you very much. My question about words again. Is success of learning crucially depend from articulatory abilities of parrots or from means of words? Is banana better than carrots if banana have B and banana is better food? Is articulatory abilities or means of word? What crucially for learning? Banana have B, and for parrots it's not good word. Yeah?
Right.
But banana is better than carrot because parrots like banana.
Right. Okay, so
What crucially for learning?
so was it
Articulatory or means?
so was it are you asking, is it easier for them to learn something they like better or something that's easier to say? Okay. I think it's easier for them to learn something they like better because there's more, incentive to learn it. And the B is really hard, but he learned to use esophageal speech to burp the B, to say the banana. Alex liked carrots. Griffin hates carrots. So we cannot, as you would expect, we cannot get him to learn to say carrot. But he learned orange because he learned it with respect to something else, where Alex learned orange because he asked us for the color of the carrot. So we had to use something different to teach Griffin the color orange. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely involved. And that's why, okay, in terms of foods, we rarely teach them labels for foods. They actually, almost all the food labels, they have picked up on their own in order to ask us for what they like. Again, Athena, who doesn't like to talk that much, but she has learned to say yam and corn, because those are her favorite foods.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I want to ask, when parrots answer your question, they just repeating your voice, parts of your voice, or they can use their own intonations?
Basically, for certain tasks, they have to repeat the labels that we give them. But for other tasks, they innovate. And this was particularly interesting. So we were giving Alex a task on number comprehension. And the task was there were several different sets of different colored blocks of different numbers. So I think there was 6 blue blocks, 4 green blocks, and 3 yellow blocks. And the question was, what color 3? And he was very bored by this task at this point, and sometimes he would just throw all the blocks on the floor, wouldn't answer at all, or give us all the wrong colors. And so I asked him this time, what color 3? And he looks at me and he goes, 5. And there were no 5 blocks on the tray. So I say, Alex, what color 3? And he says, 5. And we go back and forth. And finally I look at him and I say, okay, what color 5? I don't understand what's going on. He looks at me and he goes, none. So he figured out how to manipulate me to ask the question that he wanted to answer. And that's when he transferred his concept of absence from an absence of an attribute to an absence of a set of numbers. So these are the kinds of things that they will do using their vocalizations. I hope that answered the question.
Добрый вечер, спасибо большое. Вопрос дилетанта. Я вот в гостях тут, понимаете, очень люблю фантастику. Вот сегодня как раз закончил перечитывать Стругацких «Улитка на склоне». Мне напомнило что вы примерно этим же занимаетесь. Давайте вот как пофантазируем, что ли. Возникли методики в результате ваших исследований, да? И через 15, там, 20, то есть, ну, возникли методики какие-то, да? То есть ваши попугаи поднялись, мы опустились где-то до 7 лет и сможем поговорить, ну, об Амазонке, о красоте. Ну, вот чисто фантастика. Возможно ли? Как-то так.
So you created So let's fantasize a little bit. Let's imagine that in 15 or 20 years there are technologies to teach parrots really, really well. So is this possible that we will be able to talk to them about our interests or about traveling or whatever else?
That would be so exciting. I don't know if it's possible, but it would be really fun. I don't know. I really don't know, but it would be really fun. Maybe the next generation of students could do that.
Okay, thank you again very much. And in your book and even in this lecture, there were a few mentions of parrots' abilities to say no, to lie, or to even make jokes. So my question is, do they have their own personalities, and what do you think about that? Thanks.
Do they have essentially a sense of humor? Is that what you're asking?
No, do they have a personality?
Personalities, yes, definitely. Each bird that I've worked with has a different personality. Alex very much liked to solve problems. He liked to jump ahead of us and to show us how smart he was. Griffin, as I mentioned, he is the little boy who just says, tell me what I have to do to get the A. Just show me what to do and I will do it perfectly. Athena is manipulative. So I will give one of these examples. So she sits on the shoulder, and when she's on your shoulder, she's not supposed to chew your earrings or your shirt or your buttons or things like that. She's just supposed to sit quietly, and it's a treat to sit next to us and to cuddle. So one of my students had a shirt with a buttons over here, and she went for the button. And so we gave her a timeout. We took her off the shoulder, put her aside, and she goes, shoulder. So we put her back on the shoulder. And we did this several times, and she kept chewing the button. So then she's on the shoulder, and she goes, ring. So we give her a toy ring to play with, and she's happily chewing on the ring. And then, we look away, and I'm talking to a student about something, and I look back. She has taken the ring and carefully placed it over the button, so it looks like she's chewing the ring, but she's actually chewing the button. So, this is the kind of thing that she likes to do. So she uses her vocalizations, and if I ask her to identify a ring, why would I do that? But if she wants it for something, she will ask for it. So they are very different birds.
Thank you again. The question and answers part is really more fascinating, even more than the election. And my question is, you mentioned they were manipulating, they could share attention. They have some kind of theory of mind or something like that? Did they try to lie to you, implying that you have some you have some ideas about them?
Okay, theory of mind is really exciting, and we have tried very hard to develop a task, and we have not yet developed one that we think works. Because with children, when you do theory of mind, there's a developmental shift. So if you look at a child that's under 3 years old, they fail. And if you look at a child that's about 4 years old, they pass, and somewhere in between there. Okay, does everybody know what the theory of mind task is? Anybody who doesn't? Okay, let me explain. So the theory of mind task It's called the Sally Ann task. So you're in a room with Sally and Ann, and you show them that there's some candy that's been put in a bucket. And Ann leaves the room, and you move the candy from the bucket to the basket. And then you ask Sally, where's Ann going to look for the candy when she comes back? And if Sally is under 3, she points to the bucket, thinking that, you know, Ann knows exactly what she knows, even though Ann's not in the room. If she's over, you know, she's about 4, she'll giggle, and she'll point to the basket and say, ha-ha, she'll still think it's here. So the younger children have no theory of what the other person does or does not know, whereas the older child does. And when you try to do something like that with the birds, you end up with all sorts of different types of explanations about, you know, well, where was, you know, latency from last placement and things like that, that are not as clean. And Joseph Call did something with looking, you know, where the animal was looking in a paper that was published, and there's another paper that's come out that's, you know, disagreeing with those results. So even something like a, you know, glancing thing, and with birds with the eyes on the opposite sides of their heads, that's really a problem as to, you know, what are they really looking at. So, I mean, this is something I am fascinated by. I am really trying to come up with some kind of task that would absolutely work on this, but I haven't yet. And if anybody has some great ideas, you know, let me know, and, you know, we could try it out. Because, I mean, you need to know something like that. And my intuition is that they do. Because when you think about Athena putting that, you know, ring and thinking what we, you know, she thinks that we know that what she's knowing and things like that. I mean, that's suggestive, right? But we can't prove it.
And the last question.
Yes. Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. My question is, could you tell us something about imagination in parrots? Could they imagine something what they haven't seen or heard yet?
Man, how would a parrot imagination? That's kind of like theory of mind. But again, when you think about that task where Alex was, you know, saying 5, and he must, I mean, I am not sure, but my intuition is that he was imagining what he could do to manipulate me into asking the question he wanted to answer. And so in a sense, that is some kind of imagination. I mean, that's my intuition. In terms of, you know, something like the visual manipulation thing, you certainly have to have, I mean, I don't know if you would call it imagination, but you have to have some visions in your mind of where those little things are moving around to keep track of them. So you have to have representation of information, which is a little different from imagination. Okay, but I think it's related in some way. It's hard. It's hard.
I think this is the time to say thank you very much to Professor Ayrin Pepperberg
Well,
for
thank you. Thank you so
fantastic
much.
talk and for answering all the questions. And this is the really big event in the scientific life of St. Petersburg and entire Russia. Yes. Thank you very much again. And just would like to remind for the auditorium that our conference starts tomorrow. Please make sure that you double check the location. This is at Faculty of Psychology, Makarova Embankment 6, not here, but 2 next open lectures, the one by Professor Michael Korbalis on the 3rd, and the one by Professor Luciano Fariga on the 5th, are going to be held here according to the program. We're expecting you back. Thank you.
Again, thank you.
Just